So this week we're kind of looking at how Christology has transformed really in the last 2 centuries. Um, Really beginning with the Enlightenment and then moving into the modern and now contemporary periods, Christology, classical Christology kind of underwent some major rethinking. And I want to explain kind of why that is. So this will give us like a kind of historical overview. What changed in the way that people thought, such that classical Chalcedonian Christology no longer seemed to make sense. And you should hear some overtones from our discussion of why classical theism kind of came under attack and then moved towards what we now think of as Trinitarian or contemporary doctrine of God, contemporary Trinitarianism. Here, the issue there was primarily philosophical, and there's a little bit of that here, but really it was a transition into what we might think of the age of science, or the scientific age, or the age in which we begin to trust the sciences, the natural sciences, to give us a more or less accurate rendering of what the world is like, rather than, say, listening to the local priest or pastor as like the source of knowledge about the world. Once that transition was made, in the 16th century, it had a huge cascading effect in all areas of knowledge and thought, and eventually that sort of trickled down to Christology. So a couple of things. To begin with, remember when we were dealing with Chalcedonian Christology, we were dealing with what's essentially an ancient anthropology. Okay, so you'll recall that human beings we looked at the kind of classic tripartite Neoplatonic anthropology, where humans have a body, it's the stuff we're made out of, and then that stuff is organized according to the animal soul, which covers kind of our emotions, appetites, things that we share with the beasts, and then the human rational soul, which is sort of the seat of all things that are that only humans have, right? And so we would say, like, maybe something like sense of time, personhood, notion of self, of course reason, the capacity for abstract thought, all those types of attributes that it seems like are more or less human, and kind of in fact in ancient theology that's what the image of God usually kind of was, right? So, the animals don't have the image of God, the imago Dei. Humans do. Well, what is the image of God? It tends to be something that only humans have, that is denied to the beast. And I think that there's value in that, but I also know that this anthropology is strongly questioned in the modern period for a couple of reasons. The first is that even if you believe in a soul, right, contemporary soul theory really begins with Descartes in the 16th century, or no, the 17th century, when he, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. What Descartes said is, he's like, well, the only thing we know about the soul is not that, it does this, that. The only thing we know about the soul is it's whatever is me when my body is gone, right? If you remember Descartes' famous thought experiment, he says, well, I can imagine myself without anything that defines me, with the one thing that I can't imagine not being able to do is to think. Like no matter what I imagine myself, there's always an I doing the imagining. So I can get rid of my body, I can get rid of my past, I can get rid of my identity, I can get rid of all these things, but in my mind I can never stop thinking. And so for Descartes, that meant that he could trust that the one thing that was there is the I, the me-ness, and that's became the soul, right? It's the one part of us it's immaterial. It floats like a ghost, I guess. It sort of kind of sits in the body, maybe even controls the body in some respects. Maybe it's like there's a little ghost. You've heard the ghost in the machine. Maybe there's a ghost in the machine that's kind of pilot. It's like a pilot somewhere inside my head that kind of running everything. What that does, though, is it dramatically changes what we think of as a human being, okay? So now, at the very least, we've turned the human being into two parts: soul and body. Now, that may not seem like a huge change, but it actually is, for several reasons. So first is that on a Neoplatonic view, the body only has the shape or form that it has, only looks human, because it's organized in that way based on having a human soul. Okay, so there's a deep, in the ancient world, there's a deep connection between the kind of thing something is, its soul, its essence, and then the way that that its matter is formed. Well, that's no longer the case, right? Descartes doesn't assume that there's anything about the soul that does anything that has any connection to the body other than it seems to inhabit or pilot the body, right? Human bodies are on a Cartesian view, they're corpses that when they've got a soul working them, kind of function, move. But notice then that what the humanity here is located entirely in the soul, which is different in ancient anthropology. Ancient anthropology is actually much more like contemporary anthropology, where the form of the matter matters. It's important. It's meaningful for the being. Well, Descartes cut that up. But there's a big problem, and that is basically that after Descartes does what Descartes does, the natural sciences kick in, and they start recognizing something really important about bodies, and especially brains. And that is, everything that we seem to attribute to the soul seems to be located, or seems to be, at the very least, predicated or deeply dependent on a part of the body, namely the brain. Now, it's difficult to underemphasize the impacts of the neurosciences of the last maybe 40 years on classical notions of human anthropology, because almost every notion of human anthropology up until the early to middle 20th century involved the soul. But then the scientists started noticing that everything that we think souls do, we can see implicated somehow in the brain. Just a few examples, just so that you see that this is a problem. Even if Christians want to maintain what we call soul-body dualism, and we want to say that there's a soul, we at least, to be intellectually honest, at the very least, we have to say that the soul is radically dependent on the body. So Descartes imagines that the body dies, the soul flies away, everything's fine. We have no reason to think that's the case. Because everything that we associate with the soul is instantiated in the body, or the brain. So, for example, the classic Phineas Gage case. Phineas Gage was I think he was a metal worker or like a plumber of some sort in the early 20th century, and was a really great guy, really kind, nice. One day he was working, and a piece of pipe exploded and went through part of his frontal lobe, went all the way through, in and out of the skull, and he survived. They saved his life. But they noticed that when he woke up and when he re-engaged in life, he was what they called him a different person. It wasn't Phineas anymore. He was really irritable, angry. He had no control over his wrath, his rage, his emotions. He basically changed his entire personality overnight. Now, what does that suggest? It suggests that who Phineas Gage is strongly dependent on Phineas Gage's brain. Perhaps, maybe Phineas Gage has a soul, but however the soul expresses Phineas Gageness, is dependent. It works in and through the brain, such that the brain is the seat of personhood, something like that. There's lots of different examples. We could go on and on. The neurosciences have shown some fascinating things. One of the ones I like to share with my congregation is that the neurosciences have shown that rational thought, coldly rational thought, isn't really just rational thought. It actually goes through the emotive part of the brain, the part of brain that's strongly associated with emotions and feelings. So even when you're just working on a math equation, there's a part of you that's emotive while you're doing it. I bring this up because this is going to have radical implications for Christology. Because, first off, whatever we say about the soul, we now have to talk about Jesus' brain. If we're going to say that Jesus was truly human, we don't mean that Jesus had a human rational soul. We mean that Jesus had a human body and a human brain. Maybe he's got a human soul too, but whatever Jesus is doing, whatever Jesus' soul is doing, is being expressed in and through Jesus' whole personhood, Jesus' body. Now, that can be a little bit stressful for students who typically come from strongly dualist backgrounds, that is, backgrounds where the soul is heavily emphasized. There's a lot of issues that we can deal with that. I'll do another lecture a little bit about concerns about the soul, just so that you can see that, number one, this is actually more biblical. To be focused heavily on the body is much more biblical than to be focused on the soul. And second, why do you think resurrection is necessary? And why was that, the Christian proclamation historically? And the reason, of course, is that classical Christian thought, Old and New Testament thought, associates humanity with being fully embodied. That you can't take the body away and still be you. You'd be something else. So, for Christology, the first thing we have to recognize is however we're going to adapt the one person, two natures language of Chalcedon, we're going to have to do it in such a way that it makes sense with a contemporary anthropology. That it makes sense with Jesus' bodiliness. Okay? The second major issue that we got to deal with contemporary Christology is we have to come to terms with the classical critiques or the modern critiques of classical theism that they kind of they treat Chalcedon like a fairy tale, right? They say, well, okay, if a human being has the divine nature, like how is that even possible? That's just nonsense. Like what kind of being would be, and there's the philosophical issues, which we've kind of already talked about in some respects, thanks to Trinitarianism, right? Well, Jesus is only in one place at a time. God is omnipresent. How's that possible? Well, as Trinitarians, we can say, oh, well, there's the Spirit. The Spirit is everywhere, and specially located in history in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. But those types of questions start coming up, and really the modern critique is kind of a critique from atheism, where like the God human, like what sense does that make? The whole point of the idea of God, classically speaking, is that God is fully transcends humanity, right? Wasn't the whole point of classical theism was to say no, there's a being, a deity that is suprahuman in every possible way, like it bears almost no connection to actual humanity, so far beyond, so far transcendent, so perfect, just whatever. How could that being be truly human? Like, it seems like there's a huge problem there if the very definition of God is like that which humanity can never be, and then the next sentence be like, oh, by the way, there was an incarnation. It's like, what? How's that possible? And we've dealt with some of that by contemporary, contemporary doctrine of God kind of says, well, wait a minute, maybe God's not that, and if we take some of those burdens, as it were, off of being the deity, it might be that we can fashion a Christology that still has all the punch of Chalcedon without saddling Jesus with being something that seems like it would be impossible for a truly human person to be. With that, I think we have a pretty good basis for understanding why we kind of have to update Christology a little bit. The last thing to notice is that, remember when we were looking at all the heresies last week, one of the things we kept emphasizing over and over again is the issue was not that, the particulars of the rational soul and the animal soul and the body, and that wasn't really what was at issue, right? What was at issue was that every heretical teaching, every heretical Christology, its problem comes from that Christology's inability, or it makes it so that Jesus couldn't save. It invalidates the Christian gospel, right? And so the criteria for heresy is not this is absolutely 100% factually accurate understanding of who Jesus is, because no one's going to get that 100% right? We're talking about things that are beyond human comprehension. What Chalcedon is jealous to protect, and what heresy is violating, is the very core of Christian teaching about salvation, right? If Jesus isn't able to represent us before God, if Jesus isn't able to do all the things that the New Testament says Jesus did, that's a problem. And if your Christology prevents Jesus from doing or being those things, your Christology is heretical. But if your Christology doesn't, I think there's a lot of space for constructive thinking about Christology. As long as the Jesus that we come up with is faithful to Scripture and can actually save humanity, then I think that's a viable Christology. I may disagree with it in the particulars, but I know what it is. It's not heresy. It may be right in some cases, may be wrong in some aspects, but as long as it's not keeping Jesus from being Jesus, then I'll call it a win.